Hey there. A lot of people are worried about the possibility of Donald Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. But that might not be as easy as it sounds, as some people make it sound. Now, even though it's not a treaty, it wasn't approved by the Senate. The Paris Agreement was ratified by President Obama through what they call an executive agreement. And while that's not a legally binding agreement here in the United States, domestically, it's still an international agreement. And to unilaterally pull out of an executive agreement, that's problematic. It poses a lot of risks because, well, it's just like you've given your word basically internationally, and there are large numbers of executive agreements out there. Now, nearly every nation in the world has signed on to the Paris Agreement, and most of them have ratified, including all of the big emitters except for Russia so far, but they apparently are intending to ratify eventually. So if the United States, if Donald Trump would pull out, that would leave the opportunity for other nations with executive agreements with the United States to say, well, maybe we can also pull out of these other agreements that we don't like. So it's really not that wise of a thing to do. And plus, well, the Paris Agreement doesn't really actually take full effect until 2020. Until then, they have the extension of the Kyoto Protocol, which will be in effect for those nations that are part of that agreement. But again, pulling out of an executive agreement, not really a smart thing to do, and there's a lot of risk involved in that, the event that should happen. It's very risky, in fact. Now, the other thing is that other nations could decide to retaliate, and they would be justified in doing that, other than just pulling out of other executive agreements themselves. They could decide to, for example, retaliate by placing a carbon tax on U.S. imports. That's another huge risk that has to be considered. And the Paris Agreement, it's a huge thing. It's a huge financial opportunity. So pulling out of the agreement now, while the other nations of the world are intent on making it happen, would basically leave the U.S. out of really trillions of dollars of business opportunities. So even though they talk about it, it's much more difficult than what it seems like on the surface.